Fantastic. Well, okay, let's get started. Hi there, everybody. Welcome. ULT San Diego for the Aquarian series. Today's presentation is called Noetic Action, and that's going to be given to us by Mr. Robert Moore. But so before we begin, a reading. Saith the great law, in order to become the knower of all self, thou hast first of self to be the knower. To reach the knowledge of that self, thou hast to give up self to non-self, being to non-being. And then thou canst repose between the wings of the great bird. Aye, sweet is rest between the wings of that which is not born nor dies, but is the Aum throughout the eternal ages. Bestride the bird of life, if thou wouldst know. Give up thy life, if thou wouldst live. And now we give to you our very own Mr. Robert Moore. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Monica. We took our clues mostly from the almanac, the weekly quotes, one of which involves Om represents the constant undercurrent of meditation, which ought to be carried on by every man, even while engaged in the necessary duties of life. Now, I'm thinking that this audience, this group, is by now very familiar with the concept of noetic, because so far this year you've had 3 talks on noetic. We had a talk on noetic metaphysics, noetic psychology, and noetic ethics. And now we're on the other side of the year. So we're taking up noetic action, noetic discipline, and noetic devotion this half of the year. So noetic is a big part of the themes for this year. In preparation for the comments that I make today, I, of course, referred to H.P. Blavatsky's seminal article, Psychic and Noetic Action. And as well as that, a commentary on that article by Raghavan Iyer called Noetic Self-Determination. And then a correlative article, Noetic Discrimination. Now, these 3 articles all can be found on Theosophy Trust website easily and probably elsewhere. But that's the most readily accessible source. Now, the quote for the week says that it is necessary to increase silence in relation to speech, contemplation in relation to action, and deliberation in relation to impetuous response. So, noetic action sounds like non-action. These paradoxes that we have, because noetic action means going into silence before any kind of external action. It means thinking before acting, as in the golden verses of Pythagoras, which are also mentioned, and deliberating before one responds. How many times have you found out that you responded too quickly, that you didn't give enough forethought to the response that you were making. And then sometimes you have to spend a long time trying to bring back harmony, perhaps in a relationship. Uh, and that the kind of ideas that come up, just in general, with the idea of noetic action, is going from above below, one of the principles of theosophy, going from within without. And of course, problem with that, there's a lot of within and without. But it's always, as last week, magnanimous. That was really a wonderful presentation by Cliff Tillotson on magnanimity, which is so close to the idea of the Mahatma, the great soul. But, it's noetic action is compassionate. It's selfless, thoughtful, it's very focused. It has a sense of proportion and balance. It's always working towards unity. It finds its source in unity and its joy in unity. So those are the kind of things that we think about, just general comments about the idea of noetic action. But one thing that it kind of, this quote from Hermes, and it shows us that it's very easy to materialize the idea of action or motion. That somehow to be active is to be, kind of accomplishing a lot on the physical plane. When at the end of life, when one's doing a life review, one may find that one was most active when one wasn't doing so much. That when one was very thoughtful and considerate, spontaneously in one's relationship. So it does, as in the Pythagorean review, part of noetic action is trying to determine the nature of one's responses, the nature of one's actions, of how one is working from principle to to color one's responses and actions in the world. Now, just a review, you know that from your past talks that the noetic essentially has to do theosophically with the higher mind, with the higher mind principle, which is essentially supersensuous. So noetic action is essentially supersensuous. So that right there, puts one back in one's seat. That what we're talking about, if you're going to act from a noetic basis, you're going to move to a supersensuous plane, the noetic plane, which is beyond the phenomenal world that we experience through our senses. And that brings us back to the reincarnating ego, the silent watcher. What is often said and repeated in theosophy is the higher triad. The whole world of the higher triad is the world of nous. We could mention that in a Platonic sense, nous refers to the highest perceptive capacity of the soul ego. So noesis would be able to see the eternal archetypes, what are often called forms, but are really like eternal ideas. And they're related theosophically to the idea of hierarchies and ratios, vibrations, those fundamental symbols, geometrical symbolized, they're symbolized geometrically, these hierarchies of intelligence that come into play and are actually the source of all of the principles in nature and in man. One of the elements that's so difficult here when you think about supersensuous, in the reading from the voice of the silence that with which we began, is we have to give up being to non-being. The personal self to the impersonal self. And when we're talking about supersensuous experiences, this seems like the most difficult of all. And one kind of feeling one has is the degree to which one wants to assert one's personal will versus just a feeling of having goodwill. Goodwill would be noetic. But willfulness, which so often masquerades for activity or being active, is so often self-centered and egotistic. And actually, as HPV talks about in Psychic and Noetic Action, it's driven mostly by what we call the karma principle or the principle of desire. All principles in nature, all bases of action have their positive and negative elements. And one of the ideas of Noetic is to determine those relationships. So when karma, or the animal element, the passions and desires, dominate our self-consciousness, then we're more or less actually not acting, we're in a passive state. We're reacting to external stimuli, to internal images, and a lot of Flotsam and Jetsam on the psychic plane. Sometimes we call it the astral plane. So much of our subjectivity is bound up with all of those elements that we call subjective, but are really objective to the soul ego, to the reincarnated ego. And as analogy and correspondence is one of the noetic principles to use in theosophy. I'll bring up such an analogy in a moment. It strikes me that a good analogy to the astral light is the internet, the World Wide Web, because it can connect us all. And what do you find there? You find a lot of things that aren't valuable. You find almost infinite distractions. You find really the worst of human nature, but also you can find the best. So it's kind of analogous to our inner subjectivity, where in that realm, which is vast and has many elements, there's that in us which has sympathy with the true noesis, the higher mind, and can transmit that influence into the other vestures, as well as the affinities that we've developed life after life with other elements that have been impressed with negative thought forms, with very pinched views of the world and other human beings, where we begin to see human beings as objects and as means that we can use for our ends. Now, what is the method of which we can move away from passivity in relation to this World Wide Web to activity? And I'll just give an example how easy it is to be passive. Say you look up something on YouTube, and then they have this big column of things that all of a sudden you get interested in those things over there. And that shows you how easy it is to get distracted in the world. You can spend an hour going through videos in time that you don't have. You don't have the time to spend on those distractions. But it's interesting. A student recently said, well, what is the Noetic method? And the Bhagavad Gita, of course, is a manual in noetic action and noetic thought. But Krishna gives the method. He says, seek this wisdom by strong search, by questions, by service and humility, as William Kwan Judge translates it. That's our method, by strong search. And Bhavani Shankar, in commenting on this passage from the Bhagavad Gita, says that this will only be meaningful if we have faith. So he puts in there, there's before all of that, there has to be faith. And that faith is that there actually is divine wisdom, that our true self is immortal, and that there are those teachers who have realized self-conscious immortality. They have realized divine wisdom. And theosophically, not only that, they stand ready to help in any way that is possible all human beings that have made themselves receptive to that divine influence or noetic influence. So in a way, the Brotherhood of Bodhisattvas are a continuous element like sunlight streaming down upon humanity. So it's really, when we think of noetic in relation to ourselves as incarnated consciousness, as mind beings functioning through a brain and a physical body, which brain is essentially astral and whose senses are inner. That in that particular thing, we have to have faith, as Robert Crosby puts it, faith in our ability to learn, and faith in our teachers to teach us, as well as our ability to teach others. Now, it's interesting that in the article Psychic and Noetic Action, HB says, what is the psychic? You get different translations. We often think of psychic as kama manas, desire mind. That is what we consider to be psychic. She says that the psychic element is that self-determining capacity to overcome circumstances or override circumstances. So what's interesting to me is that sounds to me like the noetic working in the psyche. In other words, one is not bound by one circumstances, not in terms of consciousness. One may have to experience, whatever karma and externalities or the limitations of one's capacities. But one's fundamental abstract consciousness is a watcher and silent thinker. That is reflected in one's mind, and one can override the limitations of the physical brain or the astral brain. So one can abstract from those. And that self-determining capacity is kind of like karmically, it's put in terms of there are internal and external factors that determine the determination of our will, the operation of our will. So the operation of our will can be determined by external factors, or internal noetic factors can determine the operation of our will in our actions. But of course, and that's the other thing about one of the questions that comes up in psychic noetic action. The question is, do we have free will? And you see here, HPV says, we, even as incarnated beings, we do have a self-determining power. But like in any capacity, it's a matter of how much use we make of it. So, one's mathematical ability, one's ability to abstract, one's ability to articulate, all of these factors have to do with, the application of will in practice to develop the skill, to develop the faculty. So, one's self-determining power, curiously, is conditional. It's conditional to the extent to which we utilize it. So that's another curiosity. Now, the factors that help develop this self-determining capacity, some of the ways in which we can do that. Are they the strong search and the questions and trying to be of service? And part of that is learning inner silence. And part of learning inner silence is asking that question that we've heard a million times, who am I? What is the question? What's the answer to that question? The question given in the Upanishads is Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art. What is that? Well, one way that we approach that is, I'm not this body. I'm not these sights and sounds and tastes and smells and touches. I'm not these images. I'm not these thoughts. I'm not even this waking consciousness. I'm not my name and form. So you start to get, well, who am I? I'm that. What is that? And one way that is suggested by HPV is to use, I forget who she's quoting in The Secret Doctrine, but she talks about trying to, from your own consciousness of perception, And just think about that. What is your consciousness of perception? To think outward to the extremest limits in every direction. And it talks about how one's perceptions will expand out like rays from a center to an abstract circumference. And that this kind of gives us the idea of how to, that anytime we pay attention, it's like focusing, coming to a center. And from that center, we attempt to understand and expand outward. So, in the attempt to understand spiritual unity, we focus on the spiritual sun, but we have to see that sun from its center. And from that center radiates out light in all directions. And that center, when seen from that way, you'll see is everywhere. If you have space empty of all extension, any center is everywhere, and everywhere is the center. So that's one way of going to what is Tat, Tato art, Tato Amasi. And we're told in Voice of Silence that we have to learn the voidness of the seeming full and the fullness of the seeming void. So in Buddhism, you know that you have to understand the emptiness of all sensory experience, the transitoriness of all phenomena. It comes and goes. When you die, or what would remain, it can only be your thoughts. So it's our thoughts and experiences. That's what forms our experience and consciousness. That's what surrounds the soul ego. And one of the other things is that everything is unsubstantial. Well, in modern physics, we get that idea, but how difficult it is when you're thinking and when you're seeing and hearing, and you think everything's sort of concrete, but it's not concrete. It's very unsubstantial. The major component of everything is space, which in philosophical terms is never empty. Now, I'll wrap up here in a few minutes. What we're asked to do to develop our intuition so that we become noetic-like in consciousness. Buddhi Manasik is the formal phrase in theosophy. Our intuitive mind, the intuition becomes active through the influence of the mind, that searching and cognitive faculty. And the way that we're given, one of the methods in terms of questioning and searching is to use analogy and correspondence. Analogy and correspondence are said to be the Ariadne's thread. Now, where does Ariadne come in? I'm sure you all remember the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. Theseus is going to go into a labyrinth and slay a man-beast. And this Minotaur reminds me of our problem, the common monastic lower psychic mind, because it has an animal head and a human body. So it's half human half animal. And one of the things that developing discrimination is to see the animal human, that there is us in us, there's the animal, which is the the peak of the animal kingdom. But it's just bound up with desires and sensory experiences, and it has a limited life, and then it's over incarnations. It's become like a monster, like this minotaur. And Theseus, the soul ego, has to enter incarnation after incarnation. In other words, the labyrinth, to slay this obstruction to noetic insight. But that labyrinth, people go into it and they never come out. So, it's reborn over and over again, passively and beyond one's control or will. But Ariadne gives him a thread so he can find his way out. So he not only has to slay this lower psychic kama manasic part that we identify as being, he has to find his way back using, and for us, it would be back to our spiritual self, to our noetic self, using the Ariadne thread, which is said to be analogy and correspondence, which I just did. in relation to the Minotaur, I tried to make a little example of it, because the fundamental analogy in correspondence that we need to use is the idea that every day is an incarnation. We have to treat every day like an incarnation. Now, this involves all the things that are said in the quote, about silence and contemplation and deliberation. All that's involved in using each day and seeing it as an incarnation or like reincarnation. So from sleep, we're going from deep dreamless sleep or a true noetic state. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, it says that, talking about the soul ego, having subdued by sleep all that belongs to the body, he himself, not asleep, looks down upon the sleeping. So that silent watcher, that self that we go back to and doesn't move anywhere really, it's just a center. We go back to that center, and then in deep dreamless sleep, and then we come back out, and through the images that we find most favorable, and that the impressions we make in our own aura, and then into waking life. And then we live our life from morn to night. And that's that particular incarnation. And so we have to learn through that incarnation how to connect the psychic with the noetic, which, is what we were talking about, is like minimally to actualize that self-determining power which can overcome or override circumstances. So those are my comments. on Noetic Action.
Thank you, Robert. That was magnificent. You really covered a lot of ground. You left, as they say, no stone unturned. Um, you covered about shifting the ratios between the unmanifest and the manifest in the form of, quietude in relation to action and so forth. I could probably pull up the almanac quote, but contemplation in relation to action, deliberation in relation to impulse, something we can all relate to. And you talked about the active and the passive. You talked about the 4 points in the Gita about questions, humility, strong search, service. Didn't have them in the right order. And you referred to the bodhisattvas as really being like a sun. The constant ideation of the bodhisattva is like a sun. And you very much went into the overriding of circumstances. And I was very intrigued by the noetic within the psychic and how that might be. Um, and then you ended with your analogy and correspondence with Ariadne's thread, and you actually use that as your case study. And I was wondering if you could. I'll just ask a question to get us started, and then others can jump in there for sure. Is with reference to using storytelling and the analogy and correspondence within storytelling, is that a form of noetic action in and of itself? And it almost seems like it's going in some ways, into the swapna state. You're coming at it, but from above below. Like Carl Jung said that dreams are private myths and myths are collective dreams. Okay.
Yeah.
So that kind of really noetic storytelling, which you just did and displayed, I was wondering if you could talk about that in relation to noetic action.
Like, talk about storytelling in relation to noetic action.
Yes, and the idea of actually entering into that swapna state, because this is probably too complex of a question, but in some ways, the swapna state is like the three halls, the middle of the three halls.
Yeah.
And you don't want to stay there too long and all that. But on the other hand, going into that kind of a realm for the purpose of telling a story that will uplift people, it's just an interesting dynamic there, and like an opportunity, perhaps.
Well, thank you very much, Sort. And that's an interesting question because the myths there's another way like a swapna. It's swapna, or like the hall of learning,
Mhm.
the second of the three halls, the hall of probationary learning.
Mhm.
What do you think? Doesn't it seem like there's karma? Like I was talking about, how every principle has is positive and negative. But if you look at the pure animal, it's heartwarming to see the pure animal at work. I looking at animal videos that have been helped by human beings. They've been in tough circumstances. They get caught in traps or in netting or whatever. And if a human being helps them out, it doesn't always happen the case, but they always seem to be very grateful, and they actually
Yeah.
try to show some sense of gratitude. That it strikes me a very pure element, also to the karma principle that's connected with kama deva.
Mhm.
I mean, ultimately, karma is a reflection of kama deva, the creative principle behind the whole manifestation, in fact. So, in other words, so why is that how's that relate to myth? Because I will ask anybody to remember what it was like reading an archetypal story to a child, to a young child. If you've ever done that, you'll find that there's a shift in consciousness that's quite different than if you're reading that alone. You move into a very ethereal and very beautiful state that to me could be, likened to the more ethereal element of this so-called dream state, where you have imprinted in the higher astral light, or if you want to call it ether, the pure images that clothe the universal ideas of child humanity. You think about humanity when the first self-consciousness was awakened and nurtured by immortals, the self-conscious immortals, that where we are asked to regain the child state we have lost. Well, that was it. We had that state, but now it's been lost. So myths can bring us back to those states of consciousness that are akin to our childlike state, which really is just that it's an unmuddled and receptive state that has to do with with it's a merging of the head and the heart. Does that help?
Yeah,
Everybody
very
else is welcome to jump in here.
Alan wants to jump in.
Well, I won't go to the depth that you guys do. But I was just thinking that Theseus was the hero of that story. I think the labyrinth and so on. And I'm not that familiar with that story. But I was just wondering, was there emphasis in the story about the Kama Rupa energies? Was there emphasis on him having to use his lower vestures and Kama Rupa energies in order to defeat this thing? In other words, was there some value put on the capacity of having learned and exercised your lower vestures so that they could come to your rescue in this situation? Was the defeat of the creature, the monitor, whatever it was, do we recall what what the capacities were that put him under? So I guess the point of the story in large part, first you got to kill this thing, but then you don't want to get lost in there. You have to find your way out back to your higher nature. That's a beautiful thing. But do you remember the actual slaying? Do they go into any detail on that?
Well, like a lot of these myths, there aren't a lot of detail. We're just given a broad outline. But Theseus is a warrior like Arjuna. And you got to remember, you could give a lot of interpretations to this story, this myth. I gave, an interpretation that's meaningful to me. And I think you can, make a case for it, for that interpretation. But that's the Greek myth itself is much simpler. I can't remember why. There was this unnatural union that produced the Minotaur with the queen of Crete, mating with a beautiful golden bull that Neptune gave to the king. And he was supposed to sacrifice that beautiful bull to Poseidon. Just think about, well, what was that all about? But you know, it's like pure desire, right? Uh, anyhow, this bull was so beautiful, he couldn't do it. And then the queen fell in love with the bull. And so they have an unnatural union that produces the minotaur. Okay. Uh, and then I think it's every 7 years, because of an offense that Athens gave to the king of Crete. They have to send some youths that will be devoured by the minotaur every 7 years, I think. And this happens a couple times. The third time, Theseus says, "That's enough. I'll go kill this minotaur." Um, so then, you know, and Ariadne's, I think, is the daughter of the king and queen. And so she helps out Theseus. And it gives him this thread that to help him find his way out. The labyrinth itself was created by an architect that made it such that you go in, you'll never get out. So that's the myth itself.
Did Jim Tuffer jump in there for a minute?
No, I just said that Daedalus was the one who designed it.
Yeah, Daedalus, right.
Yeah, and he himself had an interesting change of things with his son. But yeah, wonderful, Robert. Really wonderful.
So, we have another 25 minutes or more. So don't everybody jump in at the last minute with their questions. If anybody can think of a question now, and if you should so desire, please feel free to turn on the camera when you ask a question. That might be kind of for the benefit of posterity when they watch these videos on YouTube. Robert was talking about the hazards of YouTube, but there's some good things on it too, like the Aquarian series, for example.
Yeah, that's the best and the worst. That's what I mean. It's a great analogy, you know, because you just get the ugliest, terrible part of humanity, but also its pristine aspirations. It's wonderful.
It's all out there. Monica. You got yours.
Unmute.
I'm sorry, I forgot. Thank you so much for this, Robert. This was great. And clarifying. But here is my idea, and I think a question. In terms of storytelling, the thing that I have had said and heard said over, I don't know how many times, is that every culture is meant to go from the tribal to the scientific. That is pretty much the destiny of man in that way. And the tribal includes storytelling. And so I'm listening to what you're speaking about, Ariadne's thread, and contemplating that idea that was relayed to this student. And I'm wondering, well, here we are in a theosophical setting. And so we have the science. We are centered in the science of the philosophy. But my question has to do with, in this getting from the tribal to the scientific, does this happen through storytelling mainly because the chi or the shakti and the intent of, say, the teacher or master has contained within the story this transference of power, let's say, that helps us move forward or upward, or however you would like to say that? Does that make any sense?
Well, yeah, if the storyteller knows what he's talking about. uh, in other words, somebody can say the same thing, like, the Dalai Lama can talk about compassion. That's a lot different than when I talk about compassion.
That's, yes,
I mean, you feel it, right? And
yes.
he can talk to hundreds of or millions, I don't know, auditoriums of thousands of people. And almost everyone there will feel the warmth of compassion, you know. So, so what I'm saying is the storyteller makes a big difference. But in terms of science, I just want to mention something about science, about theosophical science, like just a few things from the article Psychic and Noetic Action. Um, the cell's activity and behavior are determined by its being propelled either inwardly or outwardly by the noetic or psychic force. And the body is a vast sounding board, an Aeolian harp. And it's the higher mind alone that can influence the atoms in those cells,
Mhm.
which interaction is capable of exciting the brain. So this is occult physiology, but it's science.
Yes.
So that the stories are meant to awaken soul memory, you know. So that's just the occult science and physiology can explain why a story is scientific.
Thank you so much. It's
Jim,
great.
did you have a comment on Monica's question?
Well, it was an intriguing point from tribalism to science, but I would think that's in terms of actually religion to science, because tribal peoples are very much governed by religion. It's a primary element of all human communities. It's actually religion. Um, and myth, as I was explained to me once by a mythologist, is really embodied buddhi. So
Mm.
that the myths and legends and stories contain in them what are higher order truths expressed and embodied in a way that appeals to the virginal imagination of tribal peoples, as we say, who are often extremely receptive and intuitive. And then as you bring oneness into the picture and abstraction, and then think in terms of looking for causes and patterns and so forth, people tend to forget about the vital potency of myths and legends, particularly to children, which give you overarching archetypal images of man. And because we get so absorbed in nature, we forget about man. But as one physicist pointed out, we can't do without imagery in explaining string theory and this, that, and the other thing. We search for the poetic, and it helps us to understand it. And analogy and correspondence then becomes a kind of storytelling. It takes a different form, but that becomes, Robert's beautiful analogy. These analogy and correspondence are like a form of a kind of imaginary matrix in which we can grasp some deeper scientific truths. So in the end, they're going to come back. Scientists are going to become involved in meditation at some point and see what Michael Crichton said. You can say all you want, but really there are different orders of perception, different orders of experience, and different orders of rationality. And so once we become open to that, then we don't criticize the mystics we learn from.
Oh, thank you so much, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. Anyone else have a comment or a question? You could change the subject or anything you had in mind. Miluka.
Hi, everyone. Very, very interesting. No, I just I just want to mention just a comment that has to do with what Jim just said regarding Einstein said that he became a Buddhist, and he said the future religion of the future is Buddhism. And he wasn't the only one that said it. So look at how popular Buddhism has become, and it entails that experience it, that inner meditation, the inner part of us that we need to awaken, or if you call it awaken more, it's like make it quiet.
Thank you, Maluka.
Welcome.
David.
Hi there. Just a word for mythology. You know, mythology holds truth just like science. You know, for the longest time, there were these myths, for example, about Troy, right? And people called it a myth, but then we found out it was true. So it seems like that myths are containers of truth that were presented maybe more in the past than now. And you know, Campbell goes as far as saying there's really only, he had this idea of the monomyth, that there's really one myth, and it's all has to do with what we're here for, you know, the evolution of mankind. And so I'm not so sure that I agree with the way Monica put it, that you know, myth is tribal and science is like a higher octave of mythology. I don't know that that's what you were saying, Monica, but I don't think that's true at all. I think there's certain things, truths that can be expressed through myth that you won't certainly get in exact science, like the gentleman was saying earlier about poetry and things like that take us into the realm of irony, of you know, things that aren't dualistic.
Yes.
So
Thank you. If I could just respond to what you just said, David, I think that somewhere in there I may have been saying that, but I think it was also relayed to the student in that regarding ritual, you know, the tendency to think that it takes a certain amount of mechanic actions to manifest something in the world of value. It seemed to be related to the idea that man's mind, once enlightened, does not have to go through all that.
right.
You know, you don't light the candle at the certain time, and the this and that, whatever it may be. But somehow man's ability is sped up by loosening the physical ties to making something happen, where it more readily and easily, with understanding, happens at the level of the mind in a way that it may have not before.
Right.
So I think that's part of it.
Right. I mean, one last thing. You know, science at its best isn't dogmatic. You know, there's certain things that we call scientific truth, but science at its best is self-correcting.
Yes.
It's willing to admit, hey, I was wrong down the road, and now we've discovered this.
Yes. Yes.
And I guess we have to do that with the inner science.
Mhm.
And it served a
Very-
purpose at the time, but now we move on, and there's another way of approaching this. But the truth and the fire and the power that is instilled in storytelling, it can always be a go-to. Well, wait, let me go back and read that again, because somewhere along the line I must have, through my own personal misgiving, missed a step. So it would make sense that the ideas and those forces are contained in storytelling. Just
Yeah.
Maurice or Jenny?
Yes. Thank you, Robert, for a wonderful, so well-rounded presentation on, for me, a difficult subject. My question is, how does nous, or the noetic, then relate to another Greek word, dianoia, or thinking things through? Is nous the intuitive flash and reason the deliberation and logic? But maybe you could say a few words about that, the relationship between nous and dianoia.
Yeah, ratios.
Mm.
Ratio. Nous is compared in Plato anyway to seeing direct perception of truth. So it's analogous to, again, analogous to just seeing, right? If you look at something, you just see it. Nous is something like that, just direct sight. You behold what's true. Whereas dianoia means getting rid of all the elements that are not essential to the truth and connecting it up with the whole. So you think about, like, one of the elements of dianoia is mathematics. You think about geometry. Okay, you start from certain fundamental assumptions or presuppositions, and then you elaborate a whole universe of forms. But everything is connected. So dianoia, was often put by Ragavan, repeating, I forget who it was, maybe it was E.M. Forster, only connect. So dianoia means constantly connecting. It's that element where one makes cognitive unity, where one has the ability to see things in a unitary fashion and weigh things in the appropriate balance that is to be given in experience to the elements of experience.
Thank you, Robert. I have a question. And if anyone else has a question, please jump in or raise their hand. Could you speak to the Greek concept of sophrosyne and what it might have to do with noetic action?
Well, yeah. Sophrosyne, sometimes translated as temperance, but minimally it means control of one's appetites, one's appetitive nature. In a broader sense, it means gaining control over one's personality. So if we took the chariot analogy from the Katha Upanishad, that particular example of the chariot, where the horses are the senses, desire senses, and the reins are the lower kama manas. And in that analogy, the driver is said to be buddhi, and the passenger is atma. And you can move this around a bit, to make it flexible, because theosophically, buddhi would not be active without manas. So the driver would really be buddhi manas. That would be who you want to hold the reins. So buddhi manas controls all those lower forces. That's Safrazane is self-mastery, self-control. So that's one of the things that yoga is, right? Yoga is self-mastery. So and so that it means not just curbing things, that it means a really balanced livelihood, a balanced life in manifestation. So one has given everything its due proportion, its due weight in meaning and experience. It's the application of the discriminative mind to experience. So in a way, it's it's self-discipline. So it's applying what one knows as a soul ego, and then training the various principles of human nature to reflect those truths.
Thank you. Alan?
Yes.
You muted yourself.
You're muted, Alan.
Ah,
Don't be
double hit,
don't be
double
shy.
hit. Thank you. Phew. Gosh, I would hate to think you lost out on all these golden
Yeah,
concepts that I'm.
yeah,
Thank goodness. So, relative to the discriminating mind you just spoke about, and your great summary, you talked in terms of faith and noetic action, and noetic being not strictly intellectual, but including aspects of the intuition. But is there a danger here, and with both faith and noetic action? You think of, I'll now relate this to your YouTube experiences. You can now get your news on YouTube, and if you click on this news, Trump is horrible, and you click on this news, and Trump is a saint, leading us to the promised land. And so the point being that we can fool ourselves, and thinking how sneaky our personalities and lower vestures can be when we are trying to develop our intuition, when we want to have faith so that we can see beyond, so that we can take another step forward. Are there, are there safeguards? Are there things to look for relative to how so we can make sure that we're not deceiving ourselves? I mean, that's the whole point. Is we're looking for truth, of course, and we want those higher truths, but sometimes those could be a little elusive, and we can put ourselves in a compromised position if we're not careful.
yeah. And there are safeguards, which means don't impose your will on someone else. In other words, somebody else is wrong. Um, so you're going to impose the right view on them, right? You're going to enlighten them. But the idea, it's really, oh man, it's awesome. This is the awesome thing about this whole subject, because it involves free will. People are free to choose. And so people ultimately have to learn, but we're all in the boat together. So we have to suffer with them if they're wrong. And the safeguard is to accept that suffering and not impose our will on people otherwise. So, and also to be on the side of those who want to harm us or do away with us, or in whatever way. In other words, we're on the side of them as souls. We're not going to end up engaging in that same field of activity of hate and animosity and retribution. You're just not going to play that game anymore. That's the free will, stepping out of those mechanics of karma. on a lower plane of action and reaction. You know, you hit me, well, you know, you killed 1,000 of my people, I'll kill hundreds of thousands a year. So, you know, to step out of that whole mechanics is a way to freedom. So that's a safeguard, you know. So the goodwill and the not imposing and the whole of what the Bhagavad Gita is, you know, not seeking a result, you know, to have confidence in one's immortal self, which cannot lose, but it may take, you know, millions of years to work out all the complexities with one's fellow pilgrims, which ultimately form a single family. It may take a long time to work it all out. That's all that's, you know, a Prometheus, accepting all that suffering, all that imprisonment. It's really awesome.
So
Really.
in not seeking a result, you know, a thought that just came to me while you were talking about, you know, a way to approach it when others disagree with you. My experience has been that when people disagree with me, they're almost always wrong. But um, um, but maybe a healthier way to look at that, if you approach it from their mindset, if instead of, I've got, you know, you're wrong about Trump and I'm right, so now, instead of that, if you can approach it from their mindset, so, and then you can, that you can learn about that person and learn about the mindset, and you have the potential, I think, in that situation of sort of going beyond the immediate problem, and you can establish a contact with that. Now, you still may have points of disagreement, obviously, but if you try and get some depth into that person and to see what their genuine concerns are, where they're really coming from, then that could open up it seems to me like that. Would that be a strategy which could get you away from just sort of a knee-jerk response?
Yeah. Excellent suggestion. Thank you, Alan. I think that's really good. Yeah. But thank you all. I'm sorry, I have another obligation.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. If you have to go, that's fine. I'm going to stay on and see what the next talk is for next week. Oh, I know what it is. It's on the nose, by the way. So, and the symbolism of the nose, and every symbol tells a story. So there you go. All right. Thank you all for coming. And thanks to Robert for his wonderful presentation.
Yes, thank you.
Great job, Robert.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.
Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Namaste.